Let's look at policy framework for Zscaler private access. I'm going to start with the Client Connector portal. So we'll log into our Client Connector portal and look at some of the definitions and resources available to us there, which feed into the ability to use these in Zscaler private access. So first off, under administration, we have service entitlement. So based on the groups the user is a member of, we might decide whether to enable ZPA or not. So I only want my service admin from my user groups to be selected for the user group. So when the user authenticates to Zscaler Internet Access, that will provide them a group, and that group is sent to the mobile admin portal. And the mobile admin portal decides, do I continue and enroll the user in service admin group? A criterion for even getting Zscaler private access enabled is the group that you are a member of. So make decisions here for that. Device posture gives me the ability to fingerprint processes, information about the endpoint that I can then use as criteria within Zscaler private access and Zscaler internet access. We can add a new device posture and define its scope. Here, as you can see, we can select the platform, which is Mac OS in this case. Come out of here, and I'll look specifically at a Mac OS device. So I can look at certificate trust, and I can upload a certificate. And we're saying, does the machine trust this certificate? So you might put your internal root certificate authority in there, or an intermediate certificate authority that is issued somewhere to the device. A file path. I'm looking for /opt/zscaler/var/file.txt, for example, on my Mac. File.txt. Does this file exist on the machine? Client certificate is an extension of the certificate trust, and it's saying, is there a client certificate on the machine? Is it issued by a specific CA? So I upload the certificate authority here, and is there a certificate which is issued by that certificate authority? I can then perform a certificate revocation list check. So I will query the CRL endpoint. I will download the certificate revocation list, and I will compare the serial numbers of those certificates for whether the certificate has been revoked. And then I can also say that the certificate needs to have a non-exportable private key. So when this certificate was enrolled, the certificate private key was encrypted on the machine, marked non-exportable, or had a password protection on it, that then I can then say, this device is secure. This certificate is secure. It hasn't just been copied arbitrarily from one machine to the other. I can also look for the MAC firewall, and I can also look for disk encryption being enabled. We can select full disk encryption from the drop-down menu, which applies to Windows, Mac OS, and Android. Also applies to Zscaler Client Connector version 1.4 and later for Linux. Zscaler Client Connector checks if the device has full disk encryption enabled or disabled. The user must have full disk encryption enabled to pass the posture validation check. If I come across to Windows, I have a few more options available. So I can look for, is the device domain joined a specific URL? And we'll look for the registry information to tell us that it's domain joined. We'll look for a process. We'll say cprogram files explorer.x. Is this running? Is there a certificate? Or is the process signed by a digital certificate? And we upload the thumbprint to that certificate. So even if the file changes, the thumbprint will remain for the signer certificate. We can look whether Carbon Black is running. We can look whether CrowdStrike is running. We can look for Sentinel-1. And we can say, what does their CrowdStrike ZTA score tell us? And it's got to be a minimum of 70 for that process check to pass. We can look for Microsoft Defender to be running. We can say we want an antivirus running my antivirus engine and check the definitions are up to date. And under the OS version, we could say a minimum version of operating system to be running. All those things together, OS version. We can select Save, and all those things are true. So we've now got a definition that we can use in our ZPA policy. Finally, we may name the device posture and save it. We can check the Trusted Network option here and can add a trusted network. And here I can add the network name and the trusted network criteria from the dropdown, which typically defines the network information and conditions that your network must meet for Zscaler Client Connector to verify that it's one of your trusted networks. As you can see in the trusted network, you can create your own network that has DNS servers, DHCP server, DNS search domains, and default gateway. We come back to the private access dashboard. Let's also look at our IDP information under user authentication. Here, you can see predefined IDP configurations. Under a specific IDP, you can see the SAML attributes that would be displayed under SAML Attributes tab. I can also look at my SCIM attributes. So these have come across through SCIM sync, a bunch of attributes that could be sent across. And you can also search for SCIM attributes as well. If you look at my users, it's sent across the number of users to me here. Under the SCIM users, as you can, all the users are listed, and I can search here for a user. Let's move to SCIM groups. So we have a database here telling me both the SCIM information, SCIM groups, and then I have my SAML assertion, which is presented as part of that authentication request. So all these resources combined with my device posture and application segments, I can use in policy. So let's finally look at the application segments. I've got my application segments defined here, having a list of application segments with all the applications and health reporting. Now let's move to the App Protection tab and open an application and click on the Edit button under the Action tab. As we can see under the Edit Application segment, the App Protection option is enabled, indicating that the application to be inspected for security vulnerabilities. I have some predefined privileged remote access configured as well. Privileged remote access allows an admin to set up specific end users for specific privileged consoles with policies for a specific time frame. You can also choose to provide configured credentials for short-term end users or prompt end users to enter their credentials when using a privileged console. I've got browser-based access, where we've got the list of all domains, applied protocols, and applications ports. Browser access allows you to leverage a web browser for user authentication and application access over ZPA, without requiring users to install Zscaler Client Connector on their devices. For certain use cases, it might not be feasible or desirable to install Zscaler Client Connector on all devices. Let's look first at the access policy. So my access policy starts that I have Zscaler deception enabled. It's an uneditable rule for my deception traffic. You can also add your own access policy by clicking on the Add Rule button at the right. Provide the name of the rule. And we have several criteria we can look at. For example, we can apply policy based on the applications, where I can select specific applications. Click on Add Criteria to add a criterion based on applications, in our case, which is internal application. Select Application Segment and the segment group as Internal Application Group. Maybe we can add other criteria under the Client Connector Posture profile. I could also add a criterion that says I want to only allow access when that posture profile for that OS has been verified. I could add another criterion on client types. I could say, I want this rule to trigger for the web browsers, my cloud browser, my isolated browsers. Devices coming from a machine tunnel. If it's being forwarded from Zscaler Internet Access, so the ZIA to ZPA forwarding, I can select here, and I might have my client connectors, ZCC, or I can decide where it's been forwarded from the Zscaler Cloud Connector, where we're doing workload-to-workload connectivity. We can add the SAML and SCIM attributes, and by clicking on Select IDP, we can add the identity provider here and select the SAML and SCIM criteria. So I can concatenate any number of rules together to then decide to allow or block access. If I allow access, then Zscaler Private Access is going to decide to allow access, but B, select the path to steer that traffic through to the application. So I have an additional option here. Based on these criteria, I can either consider all app connectors or specific app connector groups based on this policy. Maybe I can select a specific app connector group and a server group as well in this case. And this is going to be context-based, based upon where your application is and where your users are. But we have a rich policy here to allow or deny access, and if we allow access, which path to use. And click on Save. Look at the timeout policy. Timeout policy dictates the frequency of authentication. So by default, we can decide, should users re-authenticate? In this case, I wanted them to re-authenticate every 7 days. But I might say, I want to authenticate users once a year, for example. And this applies to all users. If we want to create a timeout policy, click on the Add rule. Here, we provide the name of the policy with a description. Maybe we can add a criterion based on application segment and segment group. Likewise, we can add any number of criteria as needed. The client forwarding policy decides which applications get downloaded to the client. So consider I've defined some applications. A client would download all of these, and those definitions are available. But from a pure zero-trust framework, once I've started to define these applications, a user should only get the definitions of the applications they're approved to authenticate or access. We can create a forwarding policy by clicking the Add Rule option here. Post providing the name here, we can specify the rule action to be either forward to ZPA, only forward allowed applications, or bypass ZPA. We can also add criteria such as applications, client posture profile, client types, SAML, and SCIM attributes, and many others based on the use case. For an example, if we want to make a client forwarding policy, and that says only forward allowed applications. So in that case, we will evaluate the SAML and SCIM attributes for that access policy. Also, I might decide to specifically bypass an application definition for a user or a transaction, or I might decide to only forward specific applications to specific users. Again, there's applications, trusted networks, the client types, SAML, and SCIM attributes.